What's up, Key Issues? Garrick here, and welcome to today's video where we will be discussing everyone's favorite deus ex machina, time travel. The screenwriters of Avengers Endgame did their best to simplify time travel, stating near the beginning of the film that the future cannot be affected by them meddling in the past, which kind of actually just makes everything more confusing when you start to think about it. And we've been thinking about it a lot, so let's dive right in. So the act of time travel is made possible thanks to Hank Pym and the quantum realm, wherein time works much differently. The 5 years after the decimation were only about 5 hours for Scott Lang, so knowing this, he brought the information to the Avengers, who in turn reached out to Tony Stark, and you know the rest. The Avengers formed 4 teams to retrieve the various stones that were scattered throughout time and space. And here is where the branching timelines begin to take shape. Keep in mind what I said earlier. Going back in time and changing the past does not affect your future, but it can change that timeline's future. In fact, it creates an entirely different timeline. This is why they could not go back and just kill baby Thanos. If they did that, they would save that alternate timeline from Thanos, but their timeline and their future would not change. So with that in mind, let's take a look at all the different timelines. The first timeline diverges in New York. Iron Man and Ant-Man fail their mission of recovering the Tesseract. Loki grabs it and escapes. So in this new timeline, Loki is not captured by the Avengers and sent to Asgard. So the events of Thor: The Dark World and Thor: Ragnarok change wildly. Also, the Avengers had to dismantle the scepter to create their Infinity Gauntlet, and Captain America did not return with a scepter. So it's likely that the events of Age of Ultron never happened either, because there is no scepter, so there would be no Scarlet Witch or Quicksilver, which means that there would not be any Ultron or even Vision to create. The second diverging timeline is in the year 2014, and oh boy, is this one a doozy. War Machine and Nebula were tasked with retrieving the Power Stone. While they were able to accomplish their goal, Nebula remained on Morag after her systems malfunctioned and crossed with her past self. This ultimately led to Thanos finding out that he had won in the future and that he needed to prevent the Avengers from preventing his past self from accomplishing his goal. This causes a massive change of course for this entire timeline. This timeline now diverges from the main MCU timeline and never even experiences the snap as Thanos travels to the main timeline to battle the Avengers. So this Thanos loses in 2 timelines, because changing the past does not change the future of your timeline. It seems this Thanos was always destined to be a loser. Not sure why he was so enamored with making sure another timeline is snapped when he should worry about his own, but I mean, he probably didn't even realize that he was traveling to another timeline entirely, not just to the future of his current timeline. Not only will this timeline never experience the snap, but the Guardians of the Galaxy will never meet. It's likely that Star-Lord will remain knocked out long enough for Yondu to arrive on Morag, and Peter goes along with them. He will never meet Rocket, Groot, Gamora, and unfortunately, Drax will likely never leave prison or get his revenge on Ronan, who will probably try to supplant Thanos' position since there is no Thanos in this timeline, but Captain Marvel is still out there and she will likely stand in his way. Pretty confusing, right? But don't worry everyone, this timeline is still completely f***ed. Ego just has to get his hands on Peter, and without the Guardians there, he has no chance to defeat him, and Ego will complete the expansion. Even if Ego doesn't find Peter, he has millions of years to produce an heir that could complete the expansion. And for more information on the expansion, check out our How Powerful is Ego video. The third alternate timeline ultimately won't be affected much by the events of Endgame. Thor and Rocket didn't meddle too much here, and it seems that Frigga will still die. After Steve returns the Reality Stone as well as Mjolnir, this timeline should proceed as expected. The fourth timeline also doesn't have that much change, and the snap will likely still occur in this one. Of course, this is the timeline where Natasha and Clint travel to Vormir to retrieve the Soul Stone. The only thing different about this timeline is Natasha's body is chilling at the bottom of the cliff on Vormir, and as we know, Steve does return the Soul Stone, and something cool to think about is the reunion of Captain America and Red Skull. It's a shame that we didn't get to see that during Endgame, because that conversation would be absolutely crazy, and I would love to see it. The fifth timeline is when Steve and Tony go back to the 1970s and get the Tesseract that they failed to retrieve earlier, as well as some Pym particles. Nothing really significant happens here, except it totally does. To create the Infinity Gauntlet in the main timeline, the Avengers needed to remove the Space Stone from the Tesseract, and if they broke the Tesseract to do that, then they don't have a Tesseract to return. And if they were unable to recreate the artifact, or, pull the stone out without breaking it, Captain Marvel never receives her powers because she gets her powers through the Lightspeed engine that was created from the Tesseract. And Loki also never wields this ancient artifact, and the Avengers probably never assemble. And the final timeline is the one that Steve created by going back and living his life with Peggy. This doesn't cause any major changes in my opinion. Steve likely lived with Peggy as an unnamed husband, and the other Steve was still thawed out and joined the Avengers. The only thing curious about this is, because this is indeed a new timeline, Steve could not just grow old and give his shield to Falcon. And let me clear that up a little bit because it's kind of confusing. So Steve went back, right? And he created a new timeline by living his life with Peggy because he changed that past. And since that past does not affect the future, it created a new timeline. So he could not have grown old in this new timeline and returned his shield to the Falcon in the main timeline. So he needed to return to the main timeline using Pym particles, and because he didn't return via Hulk's platform, he either had to return through the van, or earlier through the larger platform, watching his past self kick ass until it was safe to come out. Another possibility is this Steve is not our Steve, but another one from a very similar timeline, who also came back and lived his life in secret with the Peggy that we all know, which causes all sorts of problems, so let's not think about that too much. So that's it. Those are all 6 diverging timelines created by the events of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Very, very cool that 6 timelines were created and there are 6 Infinity Stones. Some ended up being fine, while others drastically changed for the worse, in my opinion. Which timeline is the most interesting to you and why? Personally, I think the 2014 timeline where Ego successfully creates the Expanse is probably my favorite, but let me know which one is your favorite down in the comments. Also, be sure to like and subscribe. It does really, really help us out. Be sure to follow us on all these social medias that you see on screen. If you would like to support the channel, the best way to do that is to become a member, which you can do by joining down below. Also, be sure to join our Discord. It's a ton of fun. We're in there every single day. Also, remember to check out the Key Issues podcast on iTunes and SoundCloud. And remember the motto, it's Endgame over everything. And I'll see you guys next time.